Welcome to the Long Take Review, a film podcast with one eye always on the Oscar race. I'm your host, Jen Sobchak-Bankard, and I'm here with a couple of bureau agents. Are they detectives? Are they Pinkertons? We don't know. First, he won't ask any questions if you want to borrow his car. It's P.T. McNiff. How's it going, P.T.?
It's so simple. The front is the front. The back is the back. It's going well. Jen, how are you?
I'm doing great, especially now that you reminded me of that hilarious exchange. And you can call him King, just like you did when you were a child. It's Greg Cass. How's it going, Greg?
I don't know what you just said, but it must mean handsome devil. I'm good, Jen. How are you?
Great. So ready for this. We are here today to review Martin Scorsese's true crime drama, Killers of the Flower Moon, which just hit theaters this past weekend. The film adapts a 2017 book of the same name by David Grann, and it tells the story of a series of murders committed in the Osage Nation in the 1920s. It's a co-production between Paramount and Apple, so after its theatrical run, we're assuming it's going to end up on Apple TV+. If you are listening to us for the first time, we'll have a spoiler-free section designed for those who have not yet seen the film. And then, with a very clear warning, we'll shift into spoiler mode for the rest of the show. So if you haven't seen Killers of the Flower Moon yet, but you haven't decided whether or not you want to make a trip out to the theater, we're here for you to sort of recommend whether or not you would want to go do that. PT, what can listeners do if they've stumbled upon this podcast and don't want to miss all the great reviews we've got coming up?
Well, Jen, if they don't want to miss new episodes when they drop, please follow the Long Take Review wherever you get your podcasts. We host the feed on Jen's Substack, thelongtake.substack.com. But you can also follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, any place where you get your podcasts served to you. And you can also check up on us on our Instagram and Threads accounts at The Long Take Review.
Thanks, PT. So we are just about ready to get into Killers of the Flower Moon. But first, we want to do a quick movie news update. So we've had a few updates on the strike. The latest story, I guess it's not the latest, but whenever I made this outline, what the latest story was, that there was a group of some of the highest paid actors. I think George Clooney and Emma Stone were the most commonly named. And they basically tried to reopen negotiations with the AMPTP by offering up basically their own money to sort of like make up for some of the, right? Like, but it was specifically through union dues. They were going to say, we'll eliminate the cap on union dues. So we'll pay more union dues to basically pay for make it so that the financial blow is a little less. Am I getting that right?
I believe so. That sounds right. And it's one of those things that sounds on the surface like a good idea, but I understand why SAG after it was just like, shut up, guys. Like, we're trying to negotiate with them. Like, we like, let's maybe consider doing something like that internally where, you know, the people who have the top sort of 1% of the earners could spread the money around to other people within the union, but to, you know, try to share that money with the billionaire companies feels a little bit like it's just misplacing the generosity. And it's like, no, we let's still be unified. And it sounds like it got shot down pretty quickly. And it doesn't sound like there were any hard feelings about it. But it got a news cycle or two for, I think, like a day and a half. So at least it got things kind of back talking about negotiations, which, I don't know, maybe that's a benefit.
And that's the only other part of the strike news is they haven't been talking for 2 weeks, and they are going to start talking on this week again. As we are recording this, it's tomorrow morning, Tuesday, October 24th. They're going to talk again. There were promises that some of the big CEOs were actually going to be in the room. So, you know, I think we're all in a kind of dang face right now, because we were almost there. It felt like right after the writers' strike, this could be wrapped up. They'd use it as a model. And so when those negotiations fell apart again, I think a lot of us were kind of bummed out. But hopefully this means they're reopening it. They can figure this out. And then if the actors don't get quite what they want, George Clooney can give them some of that tequila money, and we'll get there.
I kept wondering whether or not this was a strategic move by these high-paid actors, right? To be like, well, let's make this absurdly generous offer that's not actually helpful for the negotiations, but continues to make the AMPTP look bad, right? That their offers are so terrible that George Clooney has to open his own wallet to fix this problem, right? So that was the only way. But otherwise, yeah, I agree with PT that people were not okay with this. They were just like, that's very nice, but not helpful. Not helpful, guys. So yeah, but hopefully at least just from the press, like attracting attention to it helped maybe push negotiations back open. Who knows? But there's some even more kind of surprising news. I don't know. Does someone else want? I can't say it.
I'll say it that the next Mission Impossible movie, Dead Reckoning Part 2, has officially been pushed back a year. So it's not coming out until 2025. I don't know if they pinned a date on it yet. But it's coming. It had been scheduled for next summer. There's still, I think, I forget what percentage of filming to do, but they've only filmed part of it before the first one came out, and they haven't been able to work on it. So they want to make sure they have enough time. So that's at least another year till we get the next Mission Impossible. Bake in times for Tom Cruise injuries and any sort of stunt disasters that might unfold. So who knows how long it will be. In less disturbing news, apparently there's a Quiet Place prequel that also got pushed. That is buried in the subhead of the article.
I will take this opportunity to officially disagree with PT as I fill in my follow-up, because you have not read the article. You are giving misinformation. The next Mission Impossible film has been pushed back a year. It is no longer titled Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 2.
What?
It is filmed to be titled later. They have taken off the Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 2 title. Now, to me, this is absurd. And what it means is when they looked at the kind of postmortem on Dead Reckoning Part 1, they didn't say, oops, we shouldn't have released this a week before Barbenheimer. They said the title confused people. So now we'll just rename it to something else. And, I think we will eventually probably have a live, die, repeat / Edge of Tomorrow situation where Dead Reckoning Part 1 is suddenly in iTunes folders as just Dead Reckoning without ever the Part 1. But I mean, I think that's a stupid lesson to take from this, and just a very, very silly thing that we all put up with this giant, long punctuation soup title, and now it's just all going away. So unbelievable.
Now I want them to keep it so it has big John Wick Chapter 3 Parabellum energy, and none of the other ones that have
have that naming scheme.
A subtitle, a subtitle beyond the chapter. Why not? Just keep it. Have it be Part 1. Tom Cruise is just promising a Part 2 sometime down the road. He'll be 90, and they'll finally do Part 2.
Well, so this feels to me like they feel that they are worried that the film, when it actually does come out eventually, will be so far out from Part 1 that people won't remember that there was a Part 1 and be like, wait, what was Part 1? Or that they're going to be, I'm not going to bother seeing that. I don't need to go see another movie to see this. You know what I mean? Like they don't want to squeeze people out just based on, I haven't seen Part 1, so I don't care about Part 2. They want to just like hard reset. So it's just trick people into thinking it's a whole new movie. I don't know.
Well, and then the very tiny silver lining, and I'm stealing directly from AV Club, that said, buried in this is one small bit of good news for Mission Impossible fans, is the new date is May 23rd, and they have already locked in the premium screens for 3 weeks exclusively. So
nice.
There you
it
go.
won't get squeezed out. I think maybe that's recognizing that Paramount did a really silly thing and should have just moved it earlier or later. I mean, we were in those doldrums of August. If it had come out like 2-3 weeks after Barbie, it would have like soared, but it just got lost in the mix. I think it's done pretty well on streaming, part one, but it was just kind of lost in the shuffle. So as probably the most weirdly devoted to this franchise of the three of us, I'll just say I'll wait. I'll give it time. I think Chris McQuarrie has, to my knowledge, put out at least 16 hours of podcast about part one. I got stuff to do. I'll listen to that, and we'll get to 2025 eventually.
Amazing. Any other movie news before we move on?
The only other strike news I've been seeing coming up on my feed is that the SAG-AFTRA recommended that any members not dress up as a character under a struck company for Halloween, devastating Los Angeles costume parties for the next few weeks. My favorite reaction to it being Weird Al talking about how because he made a biopic about himself that he can't be himself for Halloween, so he has to dress as someone totally different. He can't just hand out candy as a dad.
I liked Ryan Reynolds saying he was going to yell scab at his kids, which I think finally got SAG-AFTRA to be like, okay, maybe we need to clarify that there's some silliness here and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. Maybe, well, I mean, the kids actually technically wouldn't be members, right? So
that was the clarification they put out, is that they were encouraging nobody to dress like struck characters, but then said children are allowed. It's just the actors members. So just well, and I think it was Ryan Reynolds and Weird Al and many others making jokes that finally got them to be like, yeah, we're being pretty silly here. So
sure. We're now ready to start talking about Killers of the Flower Moon. We're going to start with our short take. So what was just your general spoiler-free reaction to this 3.5 hour epic?
I will just say it is epic. I think you feel the length in the theater, or maybe I will say I felt the length in the theater, but it was totally worth going to see. I think this is one of our great filmmakers in this, culture, giving us a very late stage masterpiece. He says he's got one more movie in him and then he'll be done. So it does feel like we should treasure this while it's there. It's a really good time. It's got amazing performances. If you love movies, this is a movie you should go out and support. So I'll keep it simple at that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I don't know if I felt the length to the degree that Greg did. There were definitely a few times where I was like, we aren't close to this, I lost track of time, but there were some moments where I was like, oh, we're not even halfway through, are we? Like, I could kind of feel myself clocking that in the background, even though, I didn't end up being like, when is this going to be over? But yeah, it's one of those experiences where I've been so looking forward to this movie now for probably like 3 years. They filmed, I think, a chunk of it before the pandemic, and then more of it, they kind of came back and did more. It was almost released last year, or, this is the third year that it felt like it was going to come out, or at least had rumors to come out. Now it's actually out. Right outside of the theater, I was a little bit like, well, could anything have lived up to all that like internal hype that I had? Which wasn't that it was disappointment or a letdown, but if you, the people listening, wanting the short take, have not been hyping yourself up for 3 years, I don't think you'll experience that. And the more I sit on it, the more I think about it, the more it's just kind of been kicking around my head the last 3 or 4 days. It only feels better and better. It really does feel like it's a masterpiece. It's sort of the culmination of this last decade of Scorsese putting out a movie every 3 or 4 years that's over 3 hours long, and really trying to make grand statements about humanity and particularly American society.
I didn't feel the length of this at all. And here's the context for this. So I saw this movie on Friday afternoon. And then Saturday afternoon, I took my mom to go see the Taylor Swift concert film, which is not as long, but it's about 2 hours and 45 minutes. So it's in the ballpark, right? They're comparable lengths, I would say. And I would say that for Killers of the Flower Moon, I was sort of engrossed the entire time. and basically didn't really notice that had how much time had passed. And when I went into the theater, it was daylight, and when I left, it was dark. So only then, when I was leaving, did I notice how much time had passed. Whereas when I was in the Taylor Swift concert film, and obviously I'm not a Taylor Swift super fan, I definitely respect and appreciate her a lot more now that I've seen this amazing high production quality. She's a performer with a capital P concert film, but it is literally just the recording of the concert. It's not cut together with anything else. So it's not really like a documentary at all or behind the scenes thing. So like there's no bonus sort of content. It's literally just as if you're sitting watching. And so right about, I could try to remember what era it was. I think folklore, maybe. I really was like, how much more is there? Like, I think I get it now. Like, and then some bits definitely pull me back in. But so I guess that's me backdooring my review of the Taylor Swift concert film by way of talking about this film. But I did not blink for a second. During Killers of the Flower Moon, I was just totally engrossed the entire time. I feel like there are a couple of incredibly brilliant choices that Martin Scorsese is making here. I am still wrestling with there's a bit of ambiguity in the story, which I'm sure we'll talk about and try to parse out and figure out later. Which I don't know how I still don't really know how I feel about it. And I'm still also wrestling with the main criticism of this, that it's doing its best to sort of center the Osage, people and represent them, do right by them and represent them well. But the main criticism I heard is that Lily Gladstone's character sort of gets sidelined after a certain point in the movie. And that, if we really were trying to bring in the Osage perspective, like, why did that happen, or like why wasn't there, people were just calling for more of her in the film. And I hope we talk about whether or not how fair an assessment that is later. But those are kind of those two things I think I'm still kind of like simmering on, and I probably would be resolved if I saw the movie again. But in general, I was just really blown away. I think just from a craft perspective, this film was absolutely dazzling. Performances in it are amazing. This is probably the best that Robert De Niro has been in a very, very long time. Lily Gladstone, let's give her, I will talk Oscars at the very end, but I want to give her an Oscar for this for sure. And so, yeah, there was so much about this that really blew me away and I was really happy about, but a couple of things where I'm like, I just have questions and I'm not settled yet, I think. But in terms of telling a story of these atrocities that were committed against the Osage people, I feel like it's gripping. I was a little skeptical, I think, when I first heard about the premise of the film. I'm like, oh, how is Martin Scorsese going to sort of tell this story? Because I don't really associate him with historical narratives, or like other than gangster films, like and as much as those can be historical. But I really thought from that perspective he did an excellent job, and that wasn't that short.
Age of Innocence and Silence Erasure from Jen.
Yeah, but
yeah,
and Gangs in New York, right?
Yeah, and Gangs in New York.
Yeah, but that's also a gangster. That's first and foremost.
That's true. A handful of movies in a 50 movie, whatever it is, 30 or 40 movie career, shows that it's an exception and not a rule.
Right. Maybe I should have said Western. This is his first Western.
Sure.
So I think it works better if you say that, probably. Well, I think we're ready to move into the recommendation algorithm, in which we establish the audience of the film. So this segment acknowledges that not every film is for everyone. So who do we think should go see this film? Like, who are we recommending it to?
People with strong bladders.
I managed to do it. I skipped the drink. I had some salty French fries beforehand to just really dehydrate me and make me unhealthy and woozy. Look, I'm gonna play the kind of cheesy lame card. I think it's important that every American go see this. This is a important piece of our history that was wiped out, and the book and now the film do an important job of making us atone with the past, where we're like, we don't have to pay for the sins of our forefathers. And Martin Scorsese has said, as he was preparing this film, he's reminding everybody, like, I went and talked to the children of the people depicted. This is not long ago. This is the 20s. A lot of these people who survived these events are still alive and had families. So I could talk to those kids. And so I went and did that. And I think this country just has a terrible habit of pretending these horrible things didn't happen, or that we don't owe something to the memory of them. We can just erase them. And, I will save it for our spin-off political show, but this is what happens when you ban books and you change history courses, is these stories get lost. And hey, it doesn't mean you're a bad person just because you're the same race as the people who did these atrocities, but it means you need to think about what it's like to be a person who's not white in this country. So I think it's really important. That's who I would say to get it. And I don't know, people who like Leo DiCaprio with fake teeth. Those are the two, and whatever Venn diagram exists between those two.
So Canadians who love Leonardo DiCaprio and all Americans.
Yep.
Why are you bringing Canadians into this?
Well, because he said it's all Americans, and then people who love Leonardo DiCaprio. So yeah, people from other countries who like Leo with weird teeth, and then all Americans. I don't know. Yeah. There's people from like Thailand who like Leonardo DiCaprio with fake teeth. Also, it didn't have to be Canadians. I mean, I co-sign everything that Greg says. It's really more I'm thinking about like, well, who shouldn't see it? And that's hard to come up with. There are acts of violence depicted in the movie, and there's some the unflinching portrayals of that, which I'm sure there are some people who already know. They already have their opinions maybe formed about what they expect from the trailers. That there are murders that happen in this, and that maybe that's something that is too squishy for them. I believe there is to follow a recent trend. There's an animal endangerment aftermath that does happen, which is just something maybe people should be aware of, a household animal. So there's those elements, but yeah, really, I think the story is really important. People should be going and seeing it. This is my opinion. I think there's a lot of people who they know this is co-produced by Apple. It's going to be on their streaming service. I don't know how many people have the Apple streaming service when Ted Lasso is not airing, but but it could be like, well, I could just watch this at home. I'll just say, when Martin Scorsese's last movie, The Irishman, was a Netflix movie, and that aired in very few theaters, but one of them was here in LA. I went to see it at the Egyptian, and I was absolutely engrossed seeing it on a big screen. I loved that movie. I thought it was great. And almost everyone I know who watched it like as a little mini series at home, because that was also like well over 3 hours long, they were like, this dragged. I couldn't pay attention. I just wasn't able to really follow along. I don't think that would similarly happen with this movie, just because of some of the elements of the story, and it's not all old people de-aged, which it was part of the thing with The Irishman. But I do think going and seeing a big sweeping movie like this with the kind of directing work that Martin Scorsese does, and the kind of cinematography done by Rodrigo Prieto, whose name I obviously just had to look up, that the visuals hit so well on a big screen, even though it is a time commitment, even though it does seem like it's like a marathon to go and be there for 3 hours and 26 minutes plus previews and commercials and all that beforehand. I think it's really worth it. I think it's worth trying to go see it in the theater, if at all possible, for if people can fit that into their lives. That's what they should do, instead of waiting a month and watching it at home, probably in bits and pieces, probably distracted by other things, not having some of those quieter scenes, character interactions just engross you, which I think can happen in the cinema.
I also say that this film, compared to The Irishman, it comes to a boil, right? In a way that I think The Irishman does it. Like, there's just a constant tension that's building and building and building, that I feel like if you were watching at home, though I agree that I think it would be much more of a transcendent experience, and sort of a change, like it would change you more as you're walking out of a theater, because you've been sort of held hostage watching it for that amount of time, versus at home when you can kind of like turn it off and walk away and come back and sort of like take respites, emotional respites from it. I think that's a big part of viewing something like this. The other thing I'll say too about Greg's comment about every American should see this, or how important it is for so many people to see this movie, I'll also say that at no point does it feel like it's lecturing at me. You know what I mean? Like, so I feel like that's sort of, if you are rejecting this movie just at face value, I would say keep in mind that it's directed by Martin Scorsese, and that because of that, it's going to have sort of all that the violence and the action and the gripping storytelling that we associate with his movies. And that's not to say it's like glamorizing it at all. That's not what I mean. But it's sort of like, you know what I mean? Like it's told in a way that is going to engage you. And you're not going to, by the end, you're going to be like, wow, this did such a great job of depicting sort of white supremacy and how, people being complicit, and that racism is is institutional, and like all this sort of stuff. Like there's all this sort of stuff that you can take away from it, but it's, when you're watching it, you're not going to feel like, oh, like, I know Martin Scorsese, like, thanks, like I knew that white people were bad, right? You know what I mean? Like, and so so I don't know if that, I don't know if anyone for whom that plea is actually listening to this right now, but I figured it needs to be said, because I think my thing that I was sort of debating, and I put this in our Google Docs, sort of the second point, is that there's going to be a debate about whether or not the History Channel dads, and I'm stealing that from an episode of Mike and Oscar I was listening to, where they sort of were debating, like, the History Channel dads are going to come out for Napoleon, but they're not going to come out for this movie. I think maybe is what they were discussing. And so, because it is sort of like interrogating American history as opposed to just being like, isn't it grand that like these crazy wars happened or something, like in a way that Napoleon might, that's no knock on Ridley Scott, but I think that's just the historical material might be lend itself to different types of stories, right? So I don't know, that's a really long way of saying, like, are people going to not watch this when they should, as Greg's saying, and is it how much is it going to appeal to that sort of like History Channel dad stereotype?
Along with that, I will just note that is exactly who the book is targeted at. And when you pick up the book, the subtitle is, the Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. Like the foundation and formation of the FBI is a core part of that story. And they cut that material way back for the film. I know we're still being spoiler free, so I won't say any more than that. But it is interesting to me that, you might get a History Channel dad who's like, oh, I loved that story about the founding of the FBI. And yeah, we get Sheriff Landry, Jesse Plemons is showing up, but it's not like a core part of the story the way the book is. So, but that is a good and helpful correction to the book, right? So these complaints that the movie doesn't do enough for the Osage, I think, it is doing much more work than the book did. And I think actually David Grann, the author, would say he attempted it but didn't do enough, and so he got the movie does a better job of it. Is my read on the relationship. So I think that's there. It's a really interesting sociological study on the History Channel dad that they want to go see Napoleon do smart things with cannons, but not necessarily their own history. But that feels dead on. I can't say that's wrong. So everybody's homework is to take their History Channel dad over Thanksgiving break and take him to go see this. He'll like it better than when you dragged him to Barbie.
Well, Greg, what you don't understand is that Napoleon, he's built different. So, that's what I think a lot of people don't realize. Whereas, I don't know if anyone from Killers of the Flower Moon is built different. They're built just like all of us, and that's the problem.
Can you drop in the more you know star sound just on that?
Unfortunately, all I have is this leftover from our Enemy of a Fall. Okay, so so I think we made a good case for why people who even think they wouldn't want to go see this should go see it, and should go see it in the theater. We'd settle for them watching it at home, I assume, though, right? Like if it's between that and nothing.
Yes, yes. I think there's a reason why Martin Scorsese, in his again the last decade or so of his work, is making movies that are the same length as like a Netflix miniseries, but is not letting them be presented as miniseries, because it's like, this is a whole complete experience that should be watched in a theater with undivided attention.
And I agree, because as I was watching it, I was sort of trying to think, if this were a miniseries, where would it break? And I could not come up with anything. You know what I mean? Like, I was just like, I guess there, but that would be weird. Like, there's no logical pause. It just keeps going. Okay. I think we're ready for spoiler mode. You know, Greg almost went there already. So if you have not seen Killers of the Flower Moon, hopefully our endorsement of it will send you to the theater. Come back once you've seen it and join us for the rest of the conversation. Okay, so in my short take, I mentioned there's some ambiguities in the film, and this is really what I want to start with, just because my own personal curiosity. I'm burning to hear your thoughts on this. But how dumb is Ernest Burkhart? And what I mean by that is, and this is very interesting. A lot of the reviews have sort of commented in some way on Leonardo DiCaprio playing against type, like that this is sort of the first time he's played a character that is really dim-witted and sort of unattractive in a way that, like, as it goes against his sort of suave movie star. Like, it's the opposite of his character in Wolf of Wall Street, who is also despicable, right? But at least was like nominally charming. And so for me, the ambiguity I was referring to really comes down to this question of, like, how much are we supposed to think that he is fully aware of and still doing it anyway, versus because a lot of the story is him being manipulated by Robert De Niro's character. And so, like, I couldn't settle on a dividing line between, like, where does Ernest Burkhart's ignorance end and his culpability begin? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, my pithy response when we broke content production rules and we're talking about this over text was that he's way less dumb than everyone around him thinks he is, but he's way dumber than he thinks he is, because he, like, is sort of underestimated, and he's not that, like, and I think especially his wife sort of thinks that, like, he isn't, he's more pure and stupid in his purity, or pure in his stupidity maybe, than some of the other people she's afraid of. Whereas, like, he thinks he's kind of being a mastermind about this. His culpability is clear. I mean, he's directly just ordering murders. Like, he is just, like, very dumbly, again, as like a dim person, just being like, I need you to blow up my sister-in-law's house, like, just to, like, people he's just met. And the unfortunate thing is, because of the time and because of the social context, like, it works for a long stretch of time. Everything's just going great for him. The one thing, and I think this is probably where you're coming from, is, I guess it's less that he's dumb and more that he's sometimes self-deluded. That's how I took it, that he was able to lie to himself that when he was causing all of this pain and all this suffering to everyone else in the Osage community around his wife, he didn't think that he was actually, like, hurting her. Like, that, like, he was able to sort of be like, well, like, I'm doing this because, like, I'm not even saying that he doesn't realize he's poisoning her, but I don't know if he feels like, I'm hurting her, I'm helping her because we're consolidating the head rights into our family. And I think that he does when he has the opportunity to sort of be like, I don't care about her, I can't wait till she's dead. He never says that, and he never kind of goes there. So I think that, it's part of the sort of complicated truth and reality of the history of white Americans thinking, like, I'm this benevolent person who's doing something good that will help for the greater good and for the greater society, including this non-white person that I really care about and love. And that's murdering everybody in their family and debilitating her until she can barely function. Like, aren't I actually, like, where's my statue? Like, where's my parade? Why isn't there a holiday named after me?
That was a long way to say he's a Ken, not an Alan, right? I think to go back to our Barbie conversation. I mean, I just had so much spark in me that I could rant for 10 minutes. So I'm going to avoid that temptation and just say, I think this is an absolutely brilliant character for exactly this question, right? Like, I think Scorsese really wants us to kind of revel in that ambiguity and to think about what that ambiguity means. Are we culpable in stories like this because of the fact that we are willfully ignorant, as PT said, right? When it comes to the actual poisoning, the refrain Ernest gives is like, well, this will just calm her, right? And King's like, yes, it'll calm her. Don't worry, it's going to help her. It becomes immediately clear that it's causing more problems than it's solving, but he just allows himself to say, nope, the trusted authority figure, the guy I want to be, my uncle, my protector, he's telling me this is helping, so I'm just going to go with it, and I'm going to keep it all in the family, and I'm going to do all that. Why I think this is brilliant is kind of twofold, and it's implied in the movie, but it is a much bigger part of the book, that the majority of the Osage are deemed incompetent by the society around them. So in order to spend their money, they are given guardians, which are always kind of the rich, white, powerful men. I believe it's a banker in the film. And the banker has to be the one to sign off. And there's this great scene in the beginning where Lily Gladstone, again, just incredible, is in a scene with one of the bankers. And the banker's asking questions like, your mom bought $300 worth of meat? And when I heard Scorsese talk about the scene, he was like, who cares? None of your business. She wants that meat. Never mind. And I was like, yes, get it, King.
The most Italian thing that Martin Scorsese's ever said.
Yes.
So why I love this is because if you look at the structure of the film, there is an incompetent. There is somebody who is not capable of making the actions make sense, of making up his own mind. And it's the one who gets handed all the power by everyone around him, including at times Lily Gladstone's character, but not always, right? She maintains a lot of power, and it's really nice. But so I thought this was like the perfect way to show the kind of old, like, whatever we project on them is actually what's true about us, right? And then the second fold of it, and this is where I'm going to stretch, and maybe I'll go into the spin-off political podcast. This character is a stand-in for modern masculinity, right? We have a huge generation of 20-year-olds. Yes, he's played by like a 45-year-old in this film, but he's supposed to be like 20, who are listless, right? They have been told they're supposed to be a certain kind of man, and they are not going to be that kind of man because, oops, now that kind of man is not acceptable anymore, which is a great thing, but they don't know what they're supposed to be. And I think you probably encountered this generation the way I encountered this generation sometimes in the classroom, and it's not 100%, but it's really this lost group who don't know what they're supposed to be. And so in Burkhart, we have a kind of he just arrives back from World War I, and he's references trauma that others experience, not his own trauma, kind of implying like, yeah, I'm fine. I was stronger than that, but probably also he was not stronger than that and has some trauma. And he just has no future and is so easily manipulated. And to me, that makes King YouTubers and fundamentalist, dangerous religious figures in other parts of the world and in our parts of the world, right? Like, it's this kind of corrupting presence that takes these listless young men and convinces them that the right purpose is protect your family. It's okay if it's a little bit of murder, right? Get lots of money. It's okay if people die,
A little bit.
right? And yeah, well, right, just light murder. Yeah, and so it just to me is like this perfect encapsulation of a kind of figure we need, and everything I just said, it's true to history. It's not like Scorsese invented any of this. He just presents it in a way where you're like, I know this guy. I've met this guy. I've seen this guy's comments on the internet. I've seen his anti-Last Jedi tweets, right? He's struggling. And since we don't have a real way to deal with mental health and emotion and all the rest in this country, we end up with darkness and corruption. So an absolutely brilliant character. And I think it is very clear that he was poisoning, and he eventually admits to it. Scorsese says the key to unlocking the movie for him was the fact that they were so deeply in love. And I think it is really hard to justify, or to not justify, excuse me, to reconcile his deep, deep love for his wife and the fact that he would do all this. But in his mind, they are the same thing. That's how much he loves his wife. And I think that's a sick and twisted mind we see around. Hey, speaking of critiques of modern masculinity, Jen, what do you have to say about the rest of us?
Wow. That's because there's no pressure there or anything.
No.
I really like your reading of that, and that helps me kind of be more comfortable, because I think my knee-jerk reaction to the ambiguity was not frustration, but just sort of like, I don't know what the movie wants me to think. And I'm like, is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. But I really like the idea that, and I have read a couple of interviews and just like critics sort of referencing interviews, establishing that sort of what you just said, of that Scorsese was like, both of these things can be true, right? Like that he can actually love her. His love for her can be real, and yet he can do all these terrible things that directly affect her. And that was the thing I didn't understand in the movie. I was just like, how did he not think that murdering her sisters was not going to upset her? Like, I don't like, you know what I mean? Like, but I guess maybe he was so arrogant to think that she would never know that was what justified it, I guess. I don't know. And so this is a sidebar question that's more just like a kind of clarification. But do you feel like the insulin was poisoned from the start?
Yeah.
Oh, you mean even before he was putting the additive in?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that it might have been. I'm going to say no. I think it may have more been that they hadn't really figured out the right formula for insulin, and so it was making her like a little bit off, and so then they just kind of leaned into it. But I'm basing that on nothing. I wouldn't be surprised if it came in poisoned, and I also wouldn't be surprised if the whole story of there's only 5 people in the world who are testing it was also not true, and was just something that King Hale told Ernest to make him feel big, so he could kind of show off and be big time to Molly.
Right, because he does persuade him to do it, because he's like, this is how you take care of your wife, right? Like, he's like, this is how, like, you have to, and you see the fruits of that messaging when, right? Because Molly initially sends the doctors away at some point, and she kind of doesn't, she expresses reservations about taking the insulin. This is before we actually see the additive that he pours in, right? It's just supposedly the regular insulin. But I feel like his argument to her is so fierce, like, I love you so much, I want what's best for you. And it's so convincing in a very sinister and creepy way, right? Because, and at that point, I feel like he was taking what was being given to him at face value, right? And being like, yes, this is medicine. This will help her. I have to give this to her, right? And at that point, it hadn't clicked that, like, oh, maybe I'm hurting her by giving it to her. So, and it's just so sad. Cause like, so I think, yes, that's the thing I kind of go back and forth with this movie, is that, like, in some moments it feels like he has just been taken in, and he's just a pawn in King's massive conspiracy against the Osage. But then there are other points where you're like, no, you have to know. You have to. And I feel like him drinking the poison towards the end, like, he pours a little bit in his whiskey glass and then throws it back. I feel like that has to be some sort of self-loathing admission, right? Where he's like, I know that I can see this is probably hurting her. It's either him testing it or being like, I know I'm hurting her, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway. And so I'm going to hurt myself too, because I can't be brave enough to stop doing this, basically.
So it is a weird moment, because I read it in the theater as like, he's testing to see if this is going to make him sick. And then that's when he kind of starts doing some kind of conscious acts. And you're like, is the film turning this into like a truth serum type of idea? Like, not literally, but like, oh, I'm now going to turn good because I've realized what I've done. And it all kind of falls apart in this kind of back and forth that happens in the last 45 minutes or so, or maybe 3 hours. I forget how long that section is. So I read it as the doctors are perhaps like the most purely evil people outside of King, right? And they make a special note about how the doctors got off the hook at the end, and didn't really pay any kind of penalty for what they've done. So my impression was they were they were when she kicks them out and they're so upset about being kicked out and they're like, you have to pay us and we came all this way. I don't think they would care, except King was demanding that they start to poison her. And then that's when he has to convince Ernest to mix in the tincture of whatever to do it. So that's how I read it. I do not remember the history. I mean, I really don't want to be the in the book guy, but the book is just so much the historical record because it's a work more of journalism and than it is any kind of novel, that it, is often helpful for clarifying those events. But I don't think that was specified. So I imagine they don't know within the historical context, right? Because that's like,
Right.
How would you know what he exactly was telling himself?
Right. And I feel like the film does such a good job of showing that the reason this did work so long, even though the sort of at the henchman level it was so sloppy, is because all of these authoritative figures, all these institutions that people are supposed to implicitly trust, doctors, I mean, less so now, but bankers, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like the everywhere in the town where you are supposed to trust these people doing the sheriff, right? Like everything is corrupt. But people operate on the assumption that they're not corrupt. And I feel like that's how they were able to get away with it for so long. And I feel like the film does such a good job of showing. That's why I was like, it got to the point where I was like, these doctors, and you see when White, Jesse Plemons' character, is interviewing them and he's asking them about like, why did you hack up this body into small pieces? And they're like, well, we're just looking for the bullet. Like, it's so thin. Their reasoning is so thin, but they're just doubling down on it where they're like, yeah, of course. Like we had to like scrape the skull off this person because we were trying to find the bullet for you. And so that's why I was like, anyone who's sick in this movie, because I think at least one or two of the sisters also seem to have the same, and maybe the mom has the same sort of wasting sickness. And I'm like, I got to the point where I was like, there's nothing to confirm this in the movie, but based on the way that they presented the doctors, I assumed that the doctors were sort of poisoning everybody. You know what I mean? Like that it was like this massive to make the, because there's some sorry, I'm getting really worked up about this. There's there's a line that King has where he's like, these people are just cursed. Like they're going to waste away. They're sick. Like he sort of blames genetics. Like they're doomed. They're going to die out anyway. Look at them. They're all sickly. They have all these diseases and health problems. Right. So it's okay. Like he uses it as a justification. It's like, okay, they're going to die anyway. We might as well just murder them now. Kind of.
I mean, I took that even further. I took that as part of his cover story. It was like, oh, I mean, and that like, he didn't think that they were a sickly people who are wasting away. He was trying to convince Ernest to think that so that he wouldn't ask questions when people would keep dying. But that's just all like, yeah. I mean, I think part of Greg talked about sort of the brilliance of the DiCaprio character. I think that's part of the brilliance of the De Niro character, where like there's never a turn with him. Like it's never like, ooh, like is this guy like secretly evil? It's just like, nope, he's unapologetically straight up evil the whole time, but just seems super genteel and nice about it, and presents it all as if he's just sort of like, man, I love all these people, but like they're children and they don't deserve all the stuff that they have. Like we need to be here to take care of it. We, the adults, the white men, are the real folk who can really do this. And like, really, it should be ours anyway. So like, we're just working to get it all back where it belongs. And everyone understands that. Right. And it's all very like reasonable. And he gets like it's just like little flashes of him being frustrated and annoyed, or occasionally even angry, but he never like explodes and he never like goes off the rails, and there's never like a mustache twirling reveal where you're surprised at what's happening. And then I think that's part of why we were saying this before the recording. I'm already looking forward to going and watching it again, because I think a lot of those early scenes will be even more devastating, because you're like, oh right, exactly what's happening. And just to add in one of I agree with you, Jen, that scene where Ernest is earnestly trying to convince his wife, like, oh, this is the medicine and I'll take care of you, blah blah blah. Baked into that, like it like is a little glimpse of how it's all still sort of a colonizer mindset of just like, and your medicine men haven't done anything to help. Like all this keeps happening, and it's like, right, it's because they convince these people that their way of dealing with things isn't going to work. You got to go to the modern white person thing, and the modern white person medical people are killing you.
Add to that list also alcohol, right? The whole stereotype of the drunk native, kind of comes out of this moment. That's a little faulty, but where we mostly get that, I think, is 50s Westerns, which is responding to these kind of early experiences in Oklahoma from the 20s that then get fictionalized and so on. There's some sloppy history doing in there. I'm passing the History Channel dad test, but I'm not like actually being a good historian at the moment. But there's the movie does such a great job. It's 3 hours and 20 minutes long. It cannot possibly give you all the details of the vast conspiracy, but it just shows you the little flashes. So you're like, oh, and that's right. That's another tool they had to keep them down. How can you get somebody to seem incompetent? Get them to look drunk in public frequently. How do you get them there? You convince them it's fun to drink, and on and on. Like it's really insidious and terrible, in hindsight, to be looking at all this kind of together. To PT's point, I do think that really is the brilliance of the De Niro character. Is DiCaprio has his kind of big arrival. They go sit down at a dinner table, and he essentially lays it all out, right? In a very kind of mob boss or kind of stupid mob boss, like, I'm not going to say the crime out loud. I know to keep the silent part silent, but I'm going to lay this all out very clearly. And while I do think Molly and Ernest had kind of real pure love, they only fell in love because of King's machinations, right? He got them together and sat them together over and over again, and then planted the seed at Ernest, and it just all fell into his plan. So I also like, this is just a little bit of a tangent, I like the balance of King being such an important societal figure and seeming so benevolent in almost every single scene, and him being the mastermind behind this, the most evil figure. We get a little clue. I think at one point it's the sheriff is like, aren't you being a little obvious, buddy, after the house gets blown up, and so on. And why I like that so much is that's the racist we all need to deal with in this country. We've dealt with the guy in the Klan hood, and if the guy's not in the Klan hood, then we are like, well, he's not that bad. And my tangent part of this is, I am like the only person who thought the To Kill a Mockingbird sequel was really important and really good. And what that book's reputation became, this is Go Set a Watchman, which had a problematic publication moment. Harper Lee didn't want it published, but they just did it anyway once she couldn't stop them, essentially. But everybody's reaction to that was like, hey, Atticus Finch isn't a racist. He's a good guy. And the brilliance of that sequel book is you take a figure like Atticus Finch and you put him on a citizens council, and there's every justification of, well, we don't want that type in town. And they become super racist. And I thought that was exactly what King is. And that's exactly the kind of racist we need to examine in this country, is the ones who smile while doing the awful things. And the kind of common way, I think I have this right, a character says in the movie, like, oh, I would never shoot a dog, but I would shoot an Indian, or like, I wouldn't be in trouble if I shot an Indian. And it's just like, we can't, I think it's a really good thing that we aren't naturally in that mindset of like, oh, right, these people hate natives. It's actually like, no, these people do not think they're human. And that we need to recognize when they're making these choices. Yes, they're dunderheaded and stupid and evil. I'm not dismissing any of that, but it's like, they are so deeply racist that they just don't understand how these people could have this money, and now we got to take it from them for their own good. They're buying airplanes. They're buying 8 cars a piece. Like, we shouldn't be able to allow that. And yeah, so there's my rant. But I do think King is really brilliant because he's that type of racist.
Yeah, and he's never hiding, right? Like, he's because, and I think that's why it's so crucial, as PT said, that he never has that explosive, like someone needles him and then his true nature, quote unquote, comes out. We never get that, right? He's true to himself the entire time, even from prison. And this is the part I laughed at so much. Yeah. It's like he's sitting in jail and still from across the hallway trying to talk to Ernest, being like, look, like, this is how we get this right? Like, we gotta, like...
The only moment where it gets close to something like, oh, the mask fell off, which is also the moment when I was like, I'm going to want Robert De Niro to win the Academy Award for this. With spoiler within the spoiler section for our Oscar watch, was when he's having, I think, dinner with the family, and Ernest announces that Molly's pregnant, and the look he gives him when he's just sort of like, what are you doing? Like, now we're like, it's clearly we're gonna have to murder a baby now too, because like we want her dead within the next 8 months. Like, what are you doing? Like, that's insane. And he says like he never loses it in a way that anyone else can see, but he has his eyes locked on DiCaprio in a way that's just like, it's so good. And it has like these interesting echoes with both De Niro and Pesci in Goodfellas, where there are similar moments when someone says something and the attention isn't really on them, but they're just like staring at that person like, what are you doing? Like, what are you talking about? And like in that movie, it's like, oh, like these people are crazy and they'll just start jumping up and punching you in the face until you're mush. But in this, it's more like it's the closest he comes to like losing that genteel cover, which
right. And it's because it's the thing he hasn't controlled it, right? Like it's not part of his plan. Is them having another baby, and so yeah, he's like, what? He's so surprised. But yeah, I agree that Robert. And what's weird is that I feel like the buzz of this film when it premiered did not really harp on Robert De Niro's performance a whole lot. So I wasn't really expecting it to be as good as it was. And I don't know if that will change now that more people see the film. But we somehow, I think, have only talked about the first question on this list that I made. So we probably should move on. And let's tackle the big criticisms about this film and sort of debate those. So I think, as I mentioned in my short take, the biggest criticism that I've heard is that, this despite attempts of Scorsese and DiCaprio and Eric Roth, right? Because there was a whole, which I don't think did we not mention this backstory, is that they wrote a screenplay that was very close to the book that mostly focused on the Jesse Plemons character in the FBI. And then they did a whole rewrite because they realized, no, like, Scorsese decided Ernest and Molly are the heart of the story. We need to recenter it on them, and sort of like include more of the Osage Nation in the actual film, as opposed to making it about the FBI. We have to make it about the Osage because they're they were the victims here. And so the big criticism is, despite all the efforts to do that the film still is a story about white men told by white men through the perspective of white men, right? And that there's not enough of the Osage. Actually, just today, I was almost going to mention it in the movie news check-in. I think one of the cast members of Reservation Dogs had like put the film on blast, basically being like, why do we keep making movies that glorify violence against Indigenous people as opposed to celebrating their culture and stuff like that? So yeah, it's sticky, like, because obviously that's a valid issue to bring up, is like, what kinds of movies get told about Indigenous peoples and what stories are we telling and who's telling them and all that sort of stuff. But I'll throw it back to either of you.
Well, this is where I have the 5-minute, not rant, but I have a 5. I was thinking about this a lot because I was also really engaging this, and I saw an interview. It looked like it was on the red carpet or maybe after the premiere, from one of the members of the Osage tribe who had been consulting on the movie, who, really looked like he was wrestling with the outcome of sort of just like, yeah, like, this is, there's a lot of elements that are in there, and like we talked about it, and that's really good. But like, this still isn't our story. It's someone else's story. And I wish that we were telling our story, and, kind of going back and forth. And I can understand that sort of pushback from the Reservation Road cast member. It sounded similar to, around when 12 Years a Slave was, winning, ultimately winning Best Picture, when people were kind of lamenting, between that and The Help. It's like, why are all the stories about Black Americans have to be their slaves or their servants, or, they're subjugated in some way, or they're slain civil rights leaders? They're like, why can't there be the other stories, the sort of positive stories that are also out there? I agree. Like, I get all of that. I think that I want there to be another movie. I mean, this is a bad example because this is two movies directed by a white man, but the sort of Flags of Our Fathers, Letters from Iwo Jima, like here's two sides of the same conflict. Like, but I'd love an Osage director and writer to do a version of these murders and tell that story, or not even the murders, but just the land, the culture, the time around it and what was happening there. That would be great. I don't know if it necessarily would make sense for Martin Scorsese and Eric Roth as his co-screenwriter, to make this like, let's like do even more. Let's be the ones to tell the Osage story. And, there's certainly an argument that it would be great if Apple gave $200 million to an Osage director to tell the story and direct it. I don't know if that would happen. And I don't know that this feels very like, I'm a white guy who's saying another white guy is doing a great job. But like Martin Scorsese's pretty good at like what he's doing. So, it's cool that he spent a lot of a big company's money to tell a story that isn't the Osage story, but is the story that is like sort of, hello, like I'm a white man and I would like to talk about how evil these other white men were and all the things that we've been saying up to this and all the stuff that, Greg was talking about, how it's so important and the ways in which this sort of insidious nature of the prejudice and the discrimination and the just, just refusal to acknowledge the humanity of these people is so important and is so hidden and not talked about, that having a white American tell that story of white Americans about those crimes is also important. And I get that it's kind of like, are we sure this isn't just a John Wayne movie where there's a bunch of white people killing a bunch of Indians and ha ha ha, like, don't we all enjoy ourselves in the theater? But like, it does not hit like that. Like, it is definitely like a scathing indictment of racism and colonialism and the sort of original sins of American life, which will bring me back to my next rant the next time around.
I feel like the scene specifically that I felt that the most, or the sort of peak of that, was when they pull Ernest. He's already flipped on them, and they pull him into that nice parlor room, and it's a very crowded room. It's a lot of people, including Brendan Fraser as King's lawyer, which I did not know he was in this movie, and I was very confused. And the way that that's shot and blocked, where Ernest is sitting in the front, and there's just like this tableau of rich old white people staring at him, and they're all like, "You're not gonna ruin this for us, right? Like, you're gonna play ball and be good, right? Like, you're not like." And they're like, and they're basically like, it's King with backup, right? Because it's like, and so that to me really reinforced the idea that the main point of this movie and the appeal that Martin Scorsese the appeal that this story had for him when he came across it and thought about making a movie about it, and obviously I'm just speculating, I'm not speaking for him, is that he's like, oh, this is like, he recognized stories that he had told before in this story. You know what I mean? He's like, oh, I can like, this is a somewhat organized crime syndicate of white people conspiring against indigenous people. Like, I'm very comfortable telling that story, right? That fits right in with my filmography. And so I think it made a lot of sense. And I think the way that he executed it was really well. And I agree with the idea that, like, I don't know if I would have wanted him to try to tell the other version that people are hoping for, because I think that probably would have been inevitably much worse and more problematic from a representational perspective. But yeah, I don't know. Greg, what do you think?
I think I just want to give the necessary caveat that the real lived experience of Native people should be respected over what we have to say on our podcast about their experience. So I think it's important you raise those objections, and I don't want to belittle or demean that perspective at all. And certainly I do think there is a problem with the fact that only white people, usually white dudes, are empowered to tell stories in our culture. And I think given that unfair power dynamic, Scorsese did the best he could to do so with respect and by bringing in as many collaborators as possible. I know you had mentioned David Chen, a great critic who really brought out this argument. Is like, I loved this movie, but this is a problematic piece of it. He had brought up how in The Creator, which we talked about, it's got this really weird recasting of the Vietnam War with no kind of South Asian people being involved in the creation at all, and that's a problem. There were some actors, obviously, but no like writers, no so on. And so I think Martin Scorsese deserves a lot of credit that he saw something in this project and wanted to do it, but he wanted to do it right. And again, when I have been referencing Scorsese said this, Scorsese said that, I am mainly alluding to he did the Directors Guild of America podcast, which if people don't listen to, it's just there's a screening of the movie somewhere in LA for members of the Directors Guild, and then the director comes out and is interviewed by another super cool director. And I think this was Ty West interviewing Scorsese. And so all of my information about like the making of the film primarily comes from that interview where he talked through a lot of this. And it is exactly what you say. DiCaprio was going to play white and was going to be a cop movie. And the book is structured very much so that you learn about all the murders, and then it's kind of a big surprise when you finally they eventually flip one or two of the little time and then eventually get Ernest to flip. That's all like a surprise late in the book. And it would make a lot of sense for the film to follow that structure. But if you want to center the Osage more, you have to tell it this way. And I do think it is a fair criticism of the book and a fair criticism of the movie that they are secondary to these characters, but they are much more present in an important way, I think, in the film than they were in the book. I'm very patient with that criticism. The criticism that gets folded into that is that how dare they sideline Lily Gladstone for so much of the later part of the movie, and that's just the events. I mean, I think it's fair to say like you miss her when she's not on screen, but that's what happened. And part of telling this incredible story about this woman who survived it is how much she suffered at the hands of who loved her. And I mean, I think part of the problem, if I'm being honest, is that the performance is too good and you forget that she's not actually sick and dying and that she's just selling the hell out of it and doing such a great job in those scenes. Do I miss her kind of staid, calm presence? Absolutely. But I don't think it's fair to say that the movie maligns her or does a discredit to her by putting her to the side. And then to co-sign the other point that you were both making is like Martin Scorsese knows how to tell this type of movie. And remember before when I was talking about those toxic men that he was maybe targeting, the other name for those are Scorsese bros, right? Dudes who saw Goodfellas and was like, that is it. That is my life. Throw it on my dorm room wall. I'm going to do this forever, right? Am I a clown to you? You laughing at me, right? And we know this type of dude. And this is saying this kind of dude is a problem. And especially because the people who think they're Ray Liotta are really Ernest Burkhart, right? Or Leonardo DiCaprio here, right? And that means that they're going to do this in a terrible way, a stupid way, and a destructive way, and a gross way, and all those words. And so I think it's really important. And Irishman and this, to me, do belong in the same conversation because it's Scorsese kind of reckoning with the legacy he was going to have and saying, I glorified a lot of things. Now, I do think dudes who think they want to be Goodfellas, like, turned it off too early or watched the cable cut or something. Yeah. Like, it's not like Casino or Goodfellas have happy, upbeat endings. Actually, Wolf of Wall Street does have a happy, upbeat ending for the main scuzzbag in a kind of ironic twist. So maybe that belongs here too. But I think all of this is Scorsese saying, like, I don't want my legacy to be empowering this type of awful story. So I'm going to tell you something that feels so much like one of my movies and show you how absolutely awful these people are. And so that's a great movie for Scorsese to tell. And to me, it actually comes down to the last shot of the film. I have limited experience. I've gone to a few lectures since we renamed here in Massachusetts. We renamed Columbus Day Indigenous Peoples Day, and we have at my university really tried to get Native speakers to come and talk about the Native experience in Massachusetts in particular. The number one thing they say is, we hate that you talk about our people only in the past tense, right? We hate that you say we were tragically wiped out. We're here, we're alive. And I got really moved in the film that the last scene is this beautiful dance of the tribe gathered, and you've got this drum beat in this gorgeous, I assume, drone shot of the drone lifting up, and you'd see that they are alive and thriving and happy, and they're real people still today. And as much as I think it's fair to criticize the film for not showing a happy kind of part of Osage history, I think it's really important that this film is like, they're still here and they are still, they are still themselves. They still have their culture. They didn't all just intermarry and raise their kids white and all of that. Like, there's still a very strong Osage nation. So I thought that was really powerful. And so I'm going to say the film kind of, in my estimation, did enough to honor that, even while telling a story that glorified a bad part of their history.
You just reminded me that that's such a perfect contrast to the opening scene, which is them burying the pipe and mourning the death of their culture, right? To show at the end that no, actually parts of it did carry on, and there's a tradition that still has survived. I think is really moving. To go back to Lily Gladstone, because I can't talk about her enough. I think for me, the takeaway was that despite being bedridden for the last act of this movie, she still saves the day, basically. Like, she still somehow manages to rally and be like, give me my $300 to take the train to Washington, D.C., right? She makes her way. She finds the president. She sends the message. And in that moment, you're kind of like, oh, is anyone going to listen to her? I don't know. But clearly, like, the next scene after that, I'm pretty sure, is Jesse Plemons knocking on Ernest Burkhart's door, right? And there might be more in between them, but like, to me, that's my memory of it. It's like one happens in sort of a cause and effect, like in the editing, to me implied that, like, okay, she did, and she says this is maybe the last thing I'll ever do, so I have to do it, and she's just making a last ditch effort to save her people, and so to me, like, yes, she's not delivering an Oscar reel speech in the third act, right? But to go back to the first act, there's a thing that King says to Ernest in that first scene where they're sitting, their first sit down, that to me is telling us how to interpret her performance. And it's the thing he says where he's like, I can't remember what animal metaphor, it's like crow talk or something like that, where he's like, he makes that weird like chittering noise in a very delightfully Robert De Niro way. But sort of explaining, look, like, when you're talking to someone who's from the Osage tribe, like, don't feel like you have to fill all the silences with just gabbing, like, and then obviously he's doing that for sinister reasons, trying to teach Ernest how to sort of like bamboozle these people and like get in with them and make them trust him and all that sort of stuff. But the way that conversation ends is he says, like, just because an Osage doesn't say anything, like they're not speaking, doesn't mean they're not telling you something, or like that they're not like saying something, right? And to me, that is what is so powerful about Lily Gladstone's performance, is that she doesn't say very much, and yet she communicates vast volumes of her, like, in her role, you know what I mean? Like, she's like, her presence is so strong, and so when she does have a line of dialogue, even when she's sort of like sweaty and incoherent in the end of the movie, right, it still packs a huge punch, and she really sells it that, like, that she actually did love Ernest, right, to the point of maybe making lots of bad decisions. Right? That she marries him despite kind of knowing who he is, right? Because there's that moment in the early on where she's talking to the sisters and they're like, he's a snake, and she's like, no, he's a coyote, and he's handsome, he's dumb, but he's handsome, and I like him, right? And like, so yeah, I don't know, I can't say enough good things about her performance.
And just to underscore that was not a written scene. those actresses came up with it. Scorsese shared this story that they had this kind of moment where the girls were just going to be there under the tent looking at the guys, and those three actresses kind of came up with how they'd say it, and the joke about like he's a rabbit to me, wink wink, and like that is just such a great little bit of characterization, and this again this wonderful kind of like these are real people and they have real lives, whatever stereotypes you kind of accidentally apply to them. So furthering the case, you're right. It's hard to see Lily Gladstone's scene being put next to Emily Blunt's Oscar scene on the reel, but I think this movie does not work without her. And again, we'll get there, but I think she belongs in the lead actress category too. So I agree with everything you just said.
Greg, she will be. That's what they said.
Yeah.
They're going to campaign her in lead.
Yeah.
So,
great.
one last to add extra praise for Lily Gladstone to Jen's point about how much she does with silence is the big kind of climactic scene is when she's in that little side room with Ernest in the courtroom and is just like, what was in the medicine or what was in the shots, I think. And then he just kind of like, looks a little bit, he goes, just insulin. And like, as soon as he says that, and cause she knows it's not true, she just gets up and walks out. And it's just like, she doesn't need to do anymore. Like there's nothing further. This is done. This is over.
It's also because he says, did you, like, she questions whether or not he genuinely fell in love with her naturally or if King set them up, and he denies it. He still sticks with no, like that's the one thing that was real was me falling in love, right?
But I thought Lithgow, that was on the stand. I thought it was Lithgow saying
their conversation afterwards. I thought I could have sworn I mean, granted, I only saw this movie once.
Me too.
But I feel like she also asked him about that.
That might be true. I guess I just thought that because he was already sort of flipping, like that he was being sincere. And so he was like, no, I did really fall in love with you. And, like separate from whether or not whatever King may have said.
But he's also lying because we have seen the scene where he basically says like, it's like, okay, like, so you sort of like this girl. Great. Like, let's put our plan in motion.
Right. I guess I took it as he did, but he did fall in love with her, even though King was like trying to make that happen. He did fall in love with her. But again, and this goes back to your original thing of like, well, how dumb is he? Is that like he was just like, no, I absolutely love her. Sure, I was poisoning her, but it was only because I love her. But yeah, it's a good point that like he's so deep in the delusion and the lie that he's just like, no, like of course not. Like,
and that's the breaking point for her, I think, is so important, right? That she's like, oh, he is lying to me about our relationship, and then so now I'm out. I can't. The murder I probably could have withstood. No, not really. But yeah. So yeah, that was sort of my counterpoint to like A, she's not in the movie enough, and B, because the other thing was like that she's too helpless, like she doesn't have agency, and I feel like if you pay close attention to her plot line, yes, she's bedridden for a lot of it, but she does actually. I think that's my interpretation, that she's the one that actually makes this happen.
Right. I think that's right.
Okay. We've already talked a bunch about performances. I guess the only thing I add to that conversation is I'm not sure this is DiCaprio's best performance. That's the thing I've been hearing a lot. Career best. I don't know if this is career best. He's amazing in it. And I think it's a really hard role to play, as we've discussed. But I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think that it's hard to say it's better than The Wolf of Wall Street when he had more to do. He had a similar length movie, but it wasn't a 3-pronged movie. It was sort of him with a few sort of people he was bouncing off of. So I've always sort of thought of that as his best performance. But it might be the most surprising performance he's done in a long time for all the reasons that Greg was mentioning earlier, and sort of, him being against type and just being, to like, there's always sort of the talk of who has the like power in a scene, and he, despite being an arbiter of life and death at times, or a harbinger of death, I guess I should say. He never really has power, and so to be a movie star and be so powerless as a character throughout, whether it's because of his emotions towards something, his avarice and greed for money, which he very openly says multiple times in the first 30 minutes of the movie. I do love money, and then being a puppet of the more powerful people. I think that is fascinating, and I think that that's something that speaks to both his commitment to performing, and also probably speaks to his relationship with Scorsese, where I don't know how many other directors he would have wanted to do that. And and credit from the stories that have been out there that you guys have both mentioned, that he was going to be the hero cop who comes in and saves the day, and then in talking to the director, he was just like, I don't know about this story, and I don't really know about this role. That person looks way more interesting. Like that, if we centered the story on that and that relationship, that would be a better role to do, and that would be a lot more. There'd be a lot more there, and credit to him for that. But yeah, it's very strange. And this was Sean Fennessy on The Big Picture. I didn't listen to the whole episode in time, but I did hear the sort of first part. And he says it where it's like, this is a dynamite DiCaprio performance, and it's clearly in third place in this movie.
Yeah.
I like that. They were so positive on this movie. They were, I think Bobby, their producer, called it a stone cold masterpiece. So
I don't know if he's right.
Which is unusual. It's unusual for them. Usually they have some kind of criticism, but I feel like for this, they were it was all good vibes.
The other point they make that I liked is they said basically all of DiCaprio's career is just him proving he's not the guy from Titanic anymore. And I do feel like there's a little of that here. I mean, the character is called handsome at different times, but he doesn't look good. He looks like a loser, and that's the point of him. And I like that DiCaprio is kind of pushing back on everything in that way. And they also made the very good joke that they're in love because they made out in a car. And cinema has taught us that when Leonardo DiCaprio hooks up with somebody in a car, it's true, unquestionable love. Essentially the same car, I think, because it's roughly the same era, give or take. So,
do we call that an Easter egg like that?
That would be amazing if it was the same car, like they called the agency and got it shipped over. I absolutely agree he's in third place in this movie. I think the character is very compelling and he executes it well, but I don't think it's as hard as some of the other parts. When you said it's not the best DiCaprio performance to you, I kind of was going through my head I don't know what I think is. I have not seen. Maybe I'll get kicked off for this. I have not seen the Revenant, which he won.
I mean,
for,
he's fine in that, but if we recall, that Oscar narrative was about how he almost died making the film.
And that's how much scent of a woman.
How much?
That's just what he got. That's not what it was.
I don't know. I even feel like his performance in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is in the running.
Yes, I do love that one. Yeah, that would probably be what I would put tops. I mean, I kind of would. I'd really like to rewatch Django in light of this film and kind of think through. That's what I said before. That's the guy in the Klan hood. We know that guy's racist. That guy's easy to mark racist, whereas these guys, it's a more complicated kind of thing to deal with. Not that I think the Django performance is up there. I just think it'd be interesting in conversation with this. But I think I would like in my rewatches to really try to focus in on him. There's a little bit of the Wolf of Wall Street again, but Margot Robbie thing going on where if you make the performance look effortless, is it really not that hard a performance, or are you just so good? So I'm not landing on either side of that. I just know I undervalued Margot Robbie after my first Barbie viewing, and actually after my first Wolf of Wall Street viewing as well, because it was like, oh, she's just beautiful and that's why they hired. But it's like, oh no, she's kind of incredible and perfect for this. So not to make this a Margot Robbie podcast, but I would like to rewatch Leo's performance. At the moment, though, and I don't know if we're making the transition or that's a category way. I still think Killian's got it. I don't think this is going to unseat Killian from the lead of that race at the moment.
Oh, well, we'll do a full Oppenheimer v. Killers of the Flower Moon when we get to the end. Don't worry. I have lots of thoughts and conflicting thoughts. Okay, but I think we are ready to go to the rhetorical situation. I think we're already broaching things that I have in here about that. So the rhetorical situation is a segment in which we look at a film through the lens of our academic experiences. So in the teaching of writing, the rhetorical situation refers to any contextual factors that influence composing and interpretation. So in general, we can talk about any contextual factors that kind of have bearing on this film. I think we've already talked about several. But for me, the thing that popped up that we haven't really talked about in the rhetorical situation in any of our other reviews is the concept of ethos. Because I think Scorsese as a director, people call him, he has so many accolades, people call him the greatest living American director, right? I feel like ethos is such a big part of how people are viewing this film. And first off, because I think ethos, out of the three pieces of the rhetorical triangle, ethos, pathos, and logos, ethos is the one that I always find the hardest to explain to students. I don't know if this is true for you as well, because it's like, well, it's sort of character, but it's also sort of like your authority and credibility as a writer or a speaker. But I think it's just any sort of bearing that the author and the persona and what we associate and know about the author kind of has on the way that we then interpret the text. And I feel like I want to start at the ending because we haven't talked about the ending, not the final shot that Greg was talking about earlier, but the whole sequence where we suddenly pull out from the main narrative and we are in the middle of a radio broadcast that's essentially like an old-timey true crime podcast version of the story. And then Martin Scorsese actually shows up at the end, which I'm going to be honest, this blew my mind when I saw it. I was by myself in the theater and didn't want to make a scene, but I was just in my brain, it was just like fireworks. I was just like, I cannot believe this is happening. This is so smart. I love how this is totally enriching the film. So I want your thoughts on like first of all, why is Marty placing himself in this movie? And just in general, how does his presence both on screen and off screen sort of impact how we interpret the story?
Well, it's funny because I believe it's his second cameo in the movie. Like yes. he was earlier at the Coolidge meeting, right?
It was just
his voice being like, we're taking a photo. And it was like, oh, what a clever little director cameo. How nice. And then the end of the movie, it's just like, I'm here. I'm Marty. I'm on stage. Yeah, I'm replacing Jack White and I'm giving the final speech. But no, yeah, I mean, I thought it was great. My sort of, I guess, main thoughts on it, and this was before I saw something, and then I couldn't find it again before we went to recording. So I'm continuing the trend of potential misinformation from earlier in the podcast. That there were shows like this. There were radio shows that were just like, here are stories of true crime that were like sponsored by the FBI. That like the FBI sort of put out like, this is the cop story, in the same way that like the LAPD really like shaped the stories on Dragnet. It was sort of, what people today might call propaganda about, what had happened. And so like that was interesting, especially in the context of how much they pulled back from the second part of the book subtitle of it, The Birth of the FBI, that it's just almost like this way it was insidiously, spread into American society. But it was interesting to me as a bookend with the opening of the movie, which was a silent film newsreel about sort of, and here's what happened with the Osage people that makes sense for the 19 teens. And so this sort of idea that we start the movie in a time at the beginning of the story, right after World War I, we have this kind of technology and this kind of storytelling. And then the movie wraps up when we sort of jump ahead through the 30s and 40s. I think up to 1950 is the last sort of moment that's mentioned. I could be wrong again. But I think like sometime in the early 50s is the last date mentioned in that concluding segment. And it's just sort of like, well, this is how media changed. And this is how media evolved and how we sort of told these narratives to ourselves. And the kind of underlying idea of, well, isn't that progress? Like, we went from, we don't have sound, we just have these sort of grainy pictures, and now we have all these sound effects, and we have this like way of communicating over the airwaves that again has this insidious nature of just sort of like, it's the advancement of white people and the advancement of culture and the spreading of wealth is progress. And that's like, we have to move forward. We can't just let the wrong kind of people have access to resources and money. So that's kind of what it felt like to me. And then giving the sort of last update on the story in the mouth of the filmmaker was, again, to the degree that the story of the Osage people can be told through a 80-year-old white man. It was like, I'm putting myself in the story, like up here to tell you, like just directly, this is the end part of what, and this is what was important, is that everybody got away with this and no one was ever punished. Like, that's what I want you to know. And that's what was the crucial thing. So that was my takeaway on it, was sort of the like, a sort of sly commentary on progress, and then a more like hammer over your head of like, I'm the filmmaker and this is what I think that you need to know.
I will just dive in and say yes to all of that. It was absolutely real. I think the name is correct. The Lucky Strike presents the so on, and this is that early move of J. Edgar Hoover to mythologize the FBI and propagandize this. So David Grann in the book is very careful to note, yes, we are definitely justifiably rethinking J. Edgar Hoover, but at this time he is this important figure about drawing together the FBI, and there is a version of this story that is very much about the FBI. And so I read everything, and this is basically me agreeing with PT but putting it in my own words, is that the ending is just telling us, again, think about the stories that get to be told, right? And we need to remember there's only one type of story that gets the slick orchestra and the Foley artist and all this really cool whiz bang stuff. There's only one version of this story that gets told that way. And it works in a couple ways to me, because it is a reminder that was the only time this whole story was pulled together before the book. And then the book actually kind of started there and did a lot more work. There's a third segment of the book, which is a bunch of new kind of crime solving that David Grann did. Basically, he started researching and he found all these additional deaths that needed to be put into this category. And so on. And so I really like that all that got left out. And instead we get the mythologizing of this event and how it is just isn't the FBI great, isn't white fantastic. And look, he's a fantastic agent. He's a hero in this story, but that's the kind of story we get to know, and we don't get to know this. And then to PT's point again, when you then shift that to Scorsese, I can't remember the other one. I thought I heard him twice in the film. And then I was like, I think that's Marty. Like, and he's Marty to me because we're old friends. I was like, I think that's him. And then it was in the Coolidge scene is correct, but there was one earlier I can't remember. And then when it was him, I was like, wow. And it made me really think about why he would make that choice, right? And I do think there's something there to we're the ones who get to tell the story. Like he is in this movie reflecting on the fact that he can tell this story, but he shouldn't be the one to tell it, right? It's kind of like how, I guess we're going to see this in December, but Spielberg has said a lot like, I am proud of The Color Purple, but I am not who should have made The Color Purple, right? And I think Marty has that relationship with some of his material. So I took the ending, and now I'm going to praise Hamilton after coming down so hard on Hamilton a few episodes ago. But Hamilton has this incredible turn at the very end where Eliza sings the last song and is singing the lyrics of Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story. And then the very last moment of the show is her kind of seeing the audience and like, oh my God, like that wasn't the end. Like there is more to tell. And that is pretty much the exact spirit in which I ended this, right? So Marty reads the language from the obituary of Anna and says, died in a trailer park. She was full-blooded Osage. and it then says the murders were not mentioned, or the narrator does. Somebody says that. And I do think that that is their way of saying, like, look, this is where history says this story ends. And that's why I love the last shot, because Marty is almost like winking at you. Is like, that's not where it ends, friends, right? They're still alive. They're still here. And that matters so much to them, right? Full-blooded Osage. Here are some full-blooded Osage still alive, still a part of this nation. And I think, making it the director doesn't feel necessary to me, but it feels like his way of kind of making sure he is demonstrating his self-awareness about this problem that the film could have. And for me personally, as one viewer, that kind of excuses the whole thing and makes it like, yep, we're who gets to tell the stories, but it's not necessarily true.
Yeah, with my students, I try to make time to talk to them about unconscious bias and subjectivity that you have as a writer, and sort of like what are ways to kind of deal with that in a piece of writing where it's relevant, and it's usually relevant. There's usually some aspect of what you're talking about that you, because of your experience and your identity, like have a blind spot of some kind. And so what I often tell them is that sometimes all you can do is just acknowledge the difference, acknowledge where you're coming from and what kind of blind spot or limitation that might place on how you are engaging with a particular conversation. And I feel like that, to me, is what Scorsese's doing here when he shows up. He's actually kind of preemptively participating in the critical discourse that we were talking about earlier, where he's like, look, I know that I am not of the Osage tribe. I know that, like, I am, closer to King than I am to Molly, right? Like he's sort of, and I think by pairing, by specifically showing up, at least in his like full visual persona, like him showing up and stepping up to the microphone in that last scene where we are sort of like pulling back the curtain and showing that it's sort of what Greg, what you were talking about when we were talking about on our last Wes Anderson episode, of like the medium is part of the message, right? And that like he's like, oh, like how you tell the story and who is telling the story and what manner absolutely matters, and that we need to be aware of that as much as the story itself. And I feel like he's sort of placing himself in that lineage, right? Of like, and now I, as this white American director, am now trying to tell this story also. And so just so you know, I am conscientious of what that might, like what limitations that might place on the type of story I can tell. And so, to me, I thought it was really, really clever. It wasn't self-indulgent at all. I'm curious. I haven't heard any criticisms of it in that sense. Most people seem very happy with it. But I can imagine someone thinking, oh, like Martin Scorsese thinks he's so great, he's putting himself in the end of his movie. But it's not, I don't think of it that way at all. There's an interview, and this is going back to kind of like the historical, who gets to tell the story, like who's included in the story and who's telling the story and the types of stories that get told. But there's an interview that I watched earlier today with Lily Gladstone and Leonardo DiCaprio. It was filmed, I think, before the strike. And she's telling about some of the research that she and Leonardo DiCaprio did. And she specifically says that the moment that broke her was they were looking at court documents of the bombing of Rita and Bill Smith's house, right, which is a huge part of the movie. And she describes it. The description is so amazing, where she's like bringing us back to that moment. She's like, there are these really like old fragile pieces of paper that we are gently flipping over and passing to each other. And she said like she had them first and then would pass, as she read a page, would pass it to Leo. And that's her words, not mine. I don't I'm happy calling Marty, but like I don't know, I draw the line at Leonardo DiCaprio, I guess. But she says that she started crying when she realized that Rita is never mentioned in these court documents, only Bill. It's like, as if only Bill had been murdered. And she was like, and that to me was why this movie is so important, because it's trying to restore some of the history that has been erased. And I feel like that's, again, in terms of the frame narrative of the black and white documentaries at the beginning, and then the sort of like radio play at the end, and then Scorsese inserting himself, being like, yeah, this is another subjective telling of the story. I'm not immune to the problems of that process. I feel like that's the big thing that this film is trying to do, is sort of being like, look, like every time you tell a story, there's some things you include and some things you don't include, and that matters.
And I've got one other type 5 that I think ties into the ethos question, because I think I agree with you, Jen. I agree with everything you were just saying, but particularly when you were talking about teaching, that ethos is the hardest of the rhetorical triangle to get across. And in addition to sort of seeing like, well, where are your blind spots? It's like, you're trying to establish to your audience, why are you someone worth listening to? And so it, partially is like, are you spelling all your words correctly and citing things properly? Like, there's ways you can fudge around with some of those things, but like, you want to look like you're someone that is engaged with this. You want to make sure you've looked at other sides, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think that, when we're having this conversation of just sort of like, well, why is this the version of the story that's being told? What Greg said earlier is very true. The people that are just sort of like, what about like our story? We don't get talked to, or we don't get, we don't get to share it. We don't get listened to. We don't pays attention to us, is very valid and should not be wiped out. And I think even, maybe I would think Scorsese would be like, yes, I would have loved it to not make this movie even though he was impassioned about it for a half dozen years, if someone had been able to come in and be like, I'll do it and I'll tell the Osage version. But I do think there's the sort of trajectory, the sort of the threads that run through Scorsese's career actually do tie in really well. And this isn't like a some sort of divergence. This isn't sort of him suddenly parachuting in to some other story and being like, let me tell you, like, you Indians, I'll tell you your story. But I think it really ties into a lot of what he's done. I'm gonna tangent into Greg's political corner that he's set up to just share that known crank Armand White. I don't know the degree to which the critic Armand White used to be, I think, with New York Magazine back in the day. He just hates everything that everyone else likes. Like, that's kind of his bit. And so he's on that, but he's over time sort of found a nice little home at the National Review, one of the sort of austere, reactionary conservative magazines, the William F. Buckley publication. And the tweet that the National Review account put out includes what I guess is a quote from the review, that this is Scorsese's first political movie because he's been radicalized against America and is, infected with the woke mind virus of hating white men. And it's just sort of like, you think this is like, you've sat down and enjoyed Taxi Driver, King of Comedy, Goodfellas, Wolf of Wall Street, Silence, and just been like Gangs of New York, and just sort of been like, just some great non-political entertainment from my man Martin Scorsese. But so there's that weird, like, crazy misinterpretation of it. But I think to get maybe a little bit back on track is the sort of Catholic underpinnings of Scorsese and the way that his religious upbringing and the sort of veering back and forth. He always sort of says that he's, he considers himself a lapsed Catholic, which I understand. But like, especially as he gets older, he's like, look, I have to just reconcile, I've looked into Buddhism. I've looked into some other things. Like, this is ingrained in me. Like, all the sort of tenets of Catholicism are a part of me. And I think that, this is something that is very present in a lot of his movies. And when people kind of do the easy, I hate to sort of paint with a broad brush. This has happened a lot with Marvel fans who are mad that he doesn't like Marvel movies. And they're like, well, he just makes, mob movies that glorify violence. And it's like, none of those movies, I mean, there is sort of the visceral fun of all of it, but there's always the cost, and there's always the sort of come down and the way that it's pulled apart. And so I feel like a key part of this movie is like the concept of penance. And like, in a way, it feels like him making this movie is going through the sacrament of penance, of being like, these things have happened. We have committed these sins. This story needs to be told. And I, as a prominent white man in America, will be part of the one to tell this up through and including, I will conclude Molly's story. Like, I'll be the one to say that, like, when she died, it was all forgot. Like, that's not on the indigenous performer. That's on me. Like, this is something that, like, I'm a part of. And tying into that is sort of this concept of original sin, that we are all conceived in a fallen state without the sanctifying grace, because we've inherited the sins of Adam and Eve, our first parents, and by extension, our forefathers. And I think that like that's so prominent in the things that he talks about. I mean, just thinking about, again, like, all those mob movies, Gangs of New York is maybe, a very sort of clear, because that is based in history. But, he has all these gangster stories from like when he was growing up, and he had these people around him. And, this was, he got sort of this firsthand knowledge of the mafia because it was our thing, the Cosa Nostra, that had come with the Italian immigrants, brought with them to America. It was the forefathers who came here, brought this, and kind of like passed it around. And he sort of has been wrestling for many of the movies throughout his career with the sort of weight of the depravity brought on by the sins that have happened before, and how we wrestle with it, and how we try to deny it, or how we try to use it. And it's just so ingrained in this story, both in sort of a conceptual, spiritual way, but also in a material, the fruits of white supremacy way that lead to him being one of the few people in the country that can get $200 million from a major company to make a movie, while all the people in the Osage tribe are, hoping that maybe they'll get, a grant somewhere to make a short film about one of their actual stories. So I don't know. I think that like that's part of the ethos that sort of seems in there, that is maybe not like immediately prominent, but that there's something to like, he's almost sort of going through an attempt to try to make it right as best as he can in his old age, and tell a story like this that's like, we all need to be better, and this is a way to try to show that people need to be better.
Well said. I like that a lot.
I don't have a tight five that is that brilliant or that smart, and agreed that was very well said. I just want to note, in all of what we said, and as a part of ethos, a commitment to the historicity keeps coming up and being repeated, and I think that's really worth noting, that one of his values is he wants to tell this story as accurately as possible. Some of the transcript of the court case was actually used. The bit where the guy is like talking to his lawyer about how, like, if I were to take these two Indian children to Mexico and they died, I would get that money. And the lawyer's like, you're telling me that you're taking them and going to kill these children? That's all verbatim. That is in transcripts of those
amazing.
meetings. That is
only if I'll get the money.
Yeah, exactly. It's like unbelievable. This one's a little bit fun, but Jen, you invoked the newsreel at the beginning a couple times. The majority of the newsreel is Martin Scorsese has a camera from that era that they just loaded up with film and shot, but the airplanes are real. So that is real archival footage, that one piece. There were these really rich Osage who bought airplanes and were like kind of gentleman pilots and played with them. And they tried to track down the families to try to get permission. They couldn't do it. And since it was public, they just decided they could still use it. But like that also, adds to the fact that we are framing it in this kind of historicity to authorize the telling of the story, while at the same time calling into question how those things are impartial or biased and so on. So it all folds into that. You could say all our history is in a fallen state, and this is just our penance to create good art to fill it in. I'm not a fallen Catholic. I just play one on this podcast.
I mean, or Greg, you can say that you've been radicalized against America.
That's true.
And it's because of the woke idea. Because of the woke idea that America's white men are spiritually sick.
That's right.
That's
our spin-off political podcast, Woke Mind Disease, coming next week.
I'm not going to follow that up because everything both of you just said was brilliant. And so I will move us into Oscars watch, because I think the fact that we've dipped into Oscars watch throughout the episode indicates that we not only have a lot to talk about, but this has a lot of Oscars prospects. The thing I've heard about Oscars so far with this movie is that people are really invoking The Irishman in the sense that it's going to get a lot of nominations, but maybe not a lot of wins. And what was particularly interesting is the big picture. They were so high on this movie. They had very few criticisms of it. At the end of the day, they were like, but this is not going to really win many Oscars. So what do we think about that? Like, do we agree with that? Do you feel like we're going to repeat The Irishman all over again, or is this a different situation?
Can I just start by just a little like, oh my God, we're finally in award season movies. I'm so excited. Like, I think we all expressed a lot of excitement in May for summer movie season. We love all movie seasons, but this one just felt to me, there have been a couple. No disrespect to Past Lives in June. No disrespect to, you all got to see Anatomy of the Fall. I only disrespect their limited theatrical run. But I will say, it just feels like this is the turning point, and now we're in it, and it's a little late, and it's going to be a weird season because of the strikes. But yeah, we're in it, and so excited. I would be really, really disappointed if this went the Irishman path. I do think we take old filmmakers for granted, and when they create something subpar, we give them their Oscar they should have won for something great. And then there's just like the long plateau after. So Marty got his on The Departed, as I recall, right? And it was like, yeah, this isn't the best one, but this is the best one lately, and so we'll give you your credits there. And then it does feel like we just usher them into this long plateau of lots of nominations and nothing. I think I fell exactly into the trap with The Irishman that PT described. I watched it at home. The pacing of that movie meant I picked up my phone a lot, and it was like, it's still going on, and all the wonky technology stuff didn't. So I totally dismissed that. If that happens to this movie, I'm going to be really upset. I think this deserves big nominations, and I think it should get some of the wins as well, and I will be really disappointed. We'll get into categories specifically, but it seems like now this is a leader for best adapted, although Oppenheimer is also best adapted, right? Or is it?
It is.
I feel like we really could have as promised, Oppenheimer versus this movie showdown.
With Poor Things creeping as well, because that's also
true.
adapted.
We just haven't seen it yet, so
which we haven't seen. But that's the other player.
Because Barbie went original. They decided Barbie was not adapted.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
So realistically, the category is looking like, and I really wish I had my predictions spreadsheet open now. I'm embarrassed I don't.
Jen, I have mine open, so I'll just jump in to. But it's Killers of the Flower Moon, Oppenheimer, Poor Things, which again we sort of had as a triangle in a lot of things. Then there were like 3 or 4 movies that all we kind of thought were vying for the last spot: Zone of Interest, All of Us Strangers, Color Purple, Priscilla, American Fiction, where it's somewhat dependent on what hits and what kind of gets some momentum. And screenplay sometimes bubbles up as like what might be not expected now will suddenly become the front runner in January, February. But I don't know. This feels like, if nothing else, especially because it's a rare instance where Scorsese is credited as the screenwriter, it's like, we can give him another Oscar, but we don't have to give him director or picture. What if we want to give someone else one of those movies, but he still gets, a solid Oscar. So yeah, to me, I'm fully with Greg. And as someone who loved The Irishman, and I will talk positively about my Irishman experience at any point if people want to, but that was sort of okay. Like I could see why suddenly it got lapped by everybody. But I hope that doesn't happen again. I especially hope that what happened with The Irishman doesn't happen here, which is Robert De Niro gets slept on and he doesn't get nominated, because I think De Niro could have gotten nominated for lead actor in The Irishman, and he didn't. And I don't think that's likely, because he seems like he's one of the 3 like strong sort of locks for supporting actor. And at this point, again, personally, my favorite. I don't know if he will actually win. I'm not making the prediction yet, but it feels right now, to start talking about categories, that like I would think it's got to be the front runner in adapted screenplay and still lead actress, even with the sort of, I don't know, like, is this a lead? Does she disappear for too long? Her presence is too strong, and as Greg was saying, like, you feel like she's gone, but it's not. It's because the character is fading away, but she's present in the movie, and her absence is part of the story. So, and then, as Jen said, when she like starts to even like do a little bit, it's monumentally important to the story. Like, it feels absolutely relevant that she's in lead. And, I think as good as Emma Stone is supposed to be in Poor Things, it feels like Emma's got hers. The narrative, if the big blowback to this movie is like, this is not their story to tell, well, she's the one who they can point to be like, well, okay, but
right,
not her.
Which I think is entirely the campaign strategy behind placing her in lead, even though based on the competition may be more of an uphill battle, because we've got Emma Stone, we've got Carey Mulligan potentially, I feel like that lead compared to supporting right now at least is a little bit more stacked and would have a lot of heavy hitters in it. So I think it all really comes down to narrative. So I think at first I remember hearing, when I heard this news of that she was going to be in supporting versus lead, I was like, oh no, her chances to win just went down a lot, because I thought she would have been a slam dunk in supporting. And so to me, I was kind of scratching my head for a little while. But I do think for the overall success of the film, Oscars wise, you have to have that narrative. And I think placing her in lead is a big cornerstone of that narrative. And for screenplay, I think it would be in the lead in front of Oppenheimer because of the narrative of how they changed it. Like if that story that we told about, well, they originally were going to be a closer adaptation to the book and be more of a traditional crime thriller with the FBI at the center. And then they had this revelation that switched it so it could focus more on Lily Gladstone's character of Molly. I feel like if that story gets out, that paired with putting Lily Gladstone in lead, I think could do it. You know what I mean? It could make a big push. But if that narrative doesn't get out and circulates, and then people don't know sort of the thoughtfulness that went behind the process of making this, maybe it doesn't do as well.
And I made a joke reference earlier to Emily Blunt in the same category. Emily Blunt has to go into supporting actress for all the reasons that we were just saying. Lily Gladstone belongs in lead actress. PT, back to your comments. You would take De Niro over Downey Jr.? You're not going to give Iron Man his Oscar?
Yes, that's correct. I love Robert Downey Jr. in Oppenheimer. And I hope this is the beginning of, a late career resurgence where he ends up with, a nomination a few years down the road, and everyone's like, how did he not win for Oppenheimer? We got to give it to him now. In what is hopefully a good performance. But I don't know. I've been comfortable for a while with the idea of like, why doesn't De Niro have a third Oscar? Like, why isn't he in that Daniel Day-Lewis, Jack Nicholson, Meryl Streep like level of triple acting winner? And there's been a little bit of squinting of just like, what if he won for Silver Linings Playbook? Like maybe, which I forget who actually won, but I believe it was the better win. But I was always like, could be good if he won. And I think this, people are correctly saying this is his, most standout performance since, you start reaching back and you're like, I don't know, when was the last time? Was it Goodfellas? I mean, he's done a lot of other fun stuff in the 90s, but you didn't know, or I feel like I didn't know he still had this level of performance in him. And so as a sort of career capper, I think that, that's kind of going to be the argument for everyone, not Lily Gladstone, who's a big name here, is, are you going to give them like an extra career capper award, or are you going to give it to someone who hasn't gotten it? And that's, if this gets, if this really starts to get in the running for director and picture, lead actor, supporting actor, it's, they already got one, but like, shouldn't they have another? Or they've got two, shouldn't they have three? So right now I would do that, because I think that it's they both have that sort of, they kind of seem like they're not bad people, and then by the end you're like, oh my god. But like the sort of magic trick level of what De Niro was doing was a little bit higher. So nothing but love. I would love it if Robert Downey Jr. won, but I would put De Niro ahead of him.
I see what you're saying. But if you're an Academy voter, I feel like the fact that it's like a surprise reveal of his evil nature at the end for Robert Downey Jr. in Oppenheimer, right? There's a more of a climactic moment where he can really throw down in his performance. Whereas I agree that what De Niro's doing is more sophisticated and more sustained, but it is sort of diffuse if you think about it. compared to, you know what I mean? So I can definitely see people gravitating towards the Robert Downey Jr.
I agree, and
performance
this
more.
is one of our somewhat divides where you're always on the prognosticating track on things, and and what I meant was I want Robert De Niro to win. I don't know if he will win, because I think it's just as likely that this movie only gets 2 or 3 wins with like 6 or 7 nominations, and you know, the most likely wins, I think, at this point, many months out, are screenplay and actress. And I'm just going to throw in, because I didn't say it before, score, because I think the score is incredible. The transitions that happen sort of in the type of music, and it's a posthumous career award for Robbie Robertson, who's done a lot of work with Scorsese over the years. So, you know, I think that those, I would be very content with those winning, and I'm comfortable saying, like, lightly predicting those. I don't think anyone else wins from this movie. I would want De Niro to win, and I would potentially choose, you know, director and picture right now, based on what I've seen. Even though I did love Oppenheimer.
You love Killers of the Flower Moon more than Oppenheimer, is what I'm hearing.
I think so, but I need to watch both of them again.
What about you, Greg?
I mean, you just stole my thunder. I was going to make you all say Leo nomination, but can't beat Cillian Murphy, because I think that's where I am. I think he gets nominated. I think Cillian Murphy's is just a better, bigger, more memorable part when it comes down to it. But to say which one of these two I preferred, I'm the lone man out on the podcast who only saw Oppenheimer once, and it was so long ago it has faded in my mind, but I can see myself craving a rewatch of that one more than a rewatch of this one. I do also think coming in as having read the book, I think some of the experience of how cool this story was lost on me. Like, I do think the film is much more towards people new to the story than people who'd read the book, which is a call you have to make, and totally a fair call. It doesn't, I'm not judging that call. So I think I probably am a little more Oppenheimer positive, but that is just taste, not necessarily I think it was better made. I just think I was drawn to that material a little bit more than this. Right? I mean, personal murder, lame. Species murder, awesome. Planet annihilation, totally awesome. I'm way more into that than I am individual murders. Come on, people. No, I mean, PT's right. I hope I can revisit both. I did see we were trying to play a game on text message. Where's Oppenheimer coming out on home release? And it finally got announced for the end of November that it'll have a home release. I think late November, early December, but it was announced because, to tell the listeners, we were debating on text message maybe that they were holding it off from home release to try to get another theatrical run on the premium screens once Aquaman inevitably fails. God, that trailer was attached to this movie for me for some reason. I don't know what they were thinking. It was like, nobody wants to see this, period, let alone sit through this garbage CG as we prepare for like an upsetting historical epic. So I don't know. Marvel's was on it too. I don't get it. I don't get what they're doing. Marketing.
I mean, I think it might just be that there aren't enough movies coming out soon.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And these are the only ones the studios want to pay to put on other studios' films and so on. So yeah, right. Crazy.
So in terms of this question of Oppenheimer versus Killers of the Flower Moon, I feel like my head says Killers of the Flower Moon, my heart says Oppenheimer.
Ooh.
And I feel
kind of head in terms of predictions and heart in terms of.
I just mean head in terms of like the intellectually the movie that I should like better.
I see.
You know what I mean?
Okay.
Like my head is telling me Killers of the Flower Moon is the better movie, but then my heart is like, but I love Oppenheimer so much, and maybe it's a matter of just the subject matter is like sort of Greg was saying, is personal taste. I don't know. Maybe I'm just like a basic Academy voter who's going to be a sucker for like the biopic, and this is not Killers of the Flower Moon is not a biopic. Maybe that's it. I don't know, but I feel like it is. I am really torn because I think a lot of the things that I really like about both movies overlap in the sense that like they both are trying to examine periods of American history in a very and like embrace the complexity of looking at of that history, and then also have this sense of dread and kind of shame about that history, in the sense of like, and it's still carrying on to today. Like it's like a light touch in terms of connecting it to our contemporary moment, but not hitting you over the head with it. And so I can see a lot of parallels between them, but they could, in terms of tone and style, I feel like they could not be more different.
Right.
Right.
There are also two movies where the big complaint is you don't spend enough time with the victims. Like, we're not telling that story.
I was going to bring that up earlier and we didn't have time, but yes, like facing the same criticisms. And so it's super interesting, but to go back to our recommendation algorithm conversation, like Academy voter, are the History Channel dads going to choose Oppenheimer over
10,000
the Flower Moon? Probably. And how many History Channel dads are still in the Academy, I think, is what this might come down to. And not all the love to the History Channel dads. I
think we all have them. I'll just say, I mean, what a blessing to have this as a debate, because these are two movies that I think we both rate very highly, and to have these sort of vying up in the top, stratosphere of our list for the year, and hopefully in the award conversation, is wonderful. The people who don't like the Academy Awards, there's lots of valid reasons. One of them is the sort of George C. Scott, why are we pitting things against each other when, like, these are just both two good movies? Like, why are we trying to like fight over what's better, or try to like make a decision one way or another? So yeah, it's very happy that we have this, and I'm glad that we can spend the next few months talking about it before Poor Things in American Fiction take all the awards from both of them.
The whole
Yeah.
thing. That's true. We're only having this kind of conversation because we haven't seen Poor Things.
Yes.
Yeah. I just want to add, enjoy it now, folks, because next year's looking bleak, right? Disney already vacated the Deadpool spot at the beginning of May, and it's going to be a dark time for movies. So
re-releases.
Let's enjoy.
It's all re-releases. Hit the archives. Every movie theater is a rep theater for 5 months next year.
Quickly, before we wrap up, do we want to give a shout out to the other categories that we think this will be nominated in? Because we've mentioned actress, screenplay, director, but what beyond that? And score. You mentioned score.
Yep.
I mean, I would
think
say
PT's list nailed it. So yeah,
those are the ones that I mean, I think it could get nominated. Cinematography, costume, production design.
I think all those craft categories.
All of those craft categories. It's certainly like viable. Unless suddenly it gets a lot of momentum, I don't think it wins any of those.
Oh, interesting.
But well, I guess what I'm, again, this is not as far out as our far out prognostication. Way too early. This is still pretty too early. I kind of think that people who haven't won before are going to, the people who work with Marty, I think, have all gotten something for his movies along the years, because he works with the same people over and over. But I think that like Oppenheimer or some of these other movies we haven't seen yet will pick up a lot of those below the line categories. I think that they'll feel reasonably comfortable with, like, you're getting a few big ones, and we'll give you score for below the line. That's good. But again, the momentum might pick up, and it could go different.
I think if they can campaign about behind the scenes stuff, about consulting with the Osage, about, especially particularly for something like costumes, I feel like that wouldn't be the make or break factor.
And there were articles today about how many blankets and what each blanket means, and so I think there is more to that story that can be told. And just the other, you mentioned the other ones coming, Napoleon too, and if Napoleon's really great, a lot of these technical categories. Would I bet on Ridley Scott after recent years where he creates something amazing that gets largely ignored? No, but if it's really good and people really love it and watch that 4-hour director's cut that is going to be on Apple TV, I think there's a chance that some of those get wiped out, just because revolutionary France feels much harder than American West in the early 20th century. That may not be true, but it feels harder, and the artistry kind of disappears in craft categories when it's familiar.
And once again, Napoleon's built different. So, that does mean something else. Yeah, I mean, and Napoleon seems to be the only other possible push for Apple original films. So I'm kind of assuming the other way, where Napoleon comes out, everyone sees the theatrical version and is like, oh, okay, Joaquin Phoenix, what a weirdo. And, maybe it gets some of those below the line, but I think that Apple will have everything into this. And I mean, Apple has won Best Picture, unlike a Netflix. So, it's possible. It's possible Apple will be able to churn out some of those stories, some of those behind the scenes things, even if the strike is still going on and they can't talk to the actors. They've got Marty, they've got the other screenwriter, they've got Thelma Schoonmaker. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but she has her narrative about editing the movie. They might have archival footage with Robbie Robertson. There's lots of people, plus the Osage people, they're members of the community they were communicating with. There's a lot of things they can get out there to keep the narrative going, keep people paying attention. So, yeah, I think it's in line for a healthy campaign. But maybe I'm just excited because we just saw it. And
also, don't forget Martin Scorsese killing it on TikTok. You were not following Francesca Scorsese, his daughter. You were missing out.
Very glad she turned off the voice filter. That
was hard. All right. Well, I think this has been a hearty and insightful conversation. Thank you both. Greg, where can folks find you on the internet?
You can find me at eyeoncanon.com. That's EYEONCANON, which links up with some of my podcasting projects. Kind of quiet at the moment, but my show Through the Glass Columns, which is reading the Wheel of Time books, continues and is evergreen. So if you want a winter reading project and want to read the Wheel of Time book series, let us be your book club, Through the Glass Columns.
Nice. And yeah, the thing I was thinking of is that as professors, fall movie season actually is like the worst time in terms of our day jobs. Like because that's really when it starts to ramp up. So I'm like, oh, if we ever get to go to a film festival someday, like it's going to be really hard for work. But that's a problem for another day.
We have to go to Cannes. It's in May.
It's in May.
The semester's over. I can learn how to pronounce it because I don't think that was the correct way of pronouncing. I think it's Cannes and not Cannes.
If you're an American, it's accepted that you say can.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's quote unquote like if you're actually a French speaker, how you say it.
I'm voting TIFF because I can drive to TIFF. It's a long one, but I can drive there. But
Toronto's a great city.
Or we need to target one that's a weekend, like one that's not like 15 days,
right,
and would require us to take time off.
Well, and to the other academics out there, I just want to pitch the Thursday night award movie screenings are awesome because it's not like a Marvel opening night where everybody, all the diehard weirdos, myself included, are there. It's like, hey, we're just the like weird 5 guys who are free on a Thursday night and want to come see American fiction by ourselves and not make eye contact with each other. Totally a great movie experience. So go for it, other people.
Great. And PT, remind folks where they can find the Long Take Review.
They can follow us on Instagram and Threads at the Long Take Review. They can also contact us via email. Send that to thelongtakereview@gmail.com.
And you can find me at Sobchakchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI on Instagram and Threads, and Qui-Gon Jinn on Letterboxd. Thank you. We did it.
Hi, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. You can follow The Long Take on Substack at thelongtake.substack.com. Subscribe for free to receive reviews of films with Oscar buzz, as well as new films and series from pop franchises like Star Wars and Marvel. Greg's never heard this before.
I was going to say, have I heard this one? This seems new.
No, I don't think you have. It's new. I really wish everyone could have seen the look
I like the
on your
second
face.
movement. We were headed to the red carpet, and now we stopped to swing on a lamppost on the way in.
The paparazzi demanded it, Greg. We need photos.
We gotta do
I do
that.
have to edit this down. I didn't have time to do that. Okay. And
Sorry,
there's
it gets
no way
late
on
enough
Zen.
doing visual bits.
I know.
so-
You get. There's no way for me
This
to
runs
pause
through
it.
the whole segment. It just never stops. It's a band.
It just never.
the
We
whole time.
can start talking. I guess I don't know.
Yeah.
So I don't really know how long this is, but maybe I will just do the same thing where we are winding down.
I mean, I think it's like they're playing us off. It's like, okay, this podcast has gone on too long.